Welcome to week 15 of Vivas. And today we're going to talk about World War One. Guys, we've passed the terrible 19th century and now we're moving into the very depressing 20th century. But personally, 20th century is the bomb. So let's get right into it. And today we're going to be answering the question, how did the First World War transform the world? Okay, so sorry, just gotta get a breath before I start. So although many people know a lot about the First World War and know the effects of the war, many people oversimplify the war and think of its main effects as leading to the rise of communism and fascism and leading to the Second World War. However, the First World War was an epochal conflict that ended the stability of the 19th century, and so it went a little beyond, its effects went a little beyond just starting World War II. So it transformed the world in three ways. Firstly, it ended the European dominance of the world and led to the USA's rise in power. Second, it ended ancient traditions and paved the way for rising technological innovations. And then thirdly, it ended the dominance of monarchy and led to the rise of democracy in European politics. So first, let's talk about how it led to the death of the European dominance. So obviously, from about the 15th century to the 20th century, Europe was dominating the world, right? They had colonies everywhere, and this colonial enterprise kept them in the forefront as a forefront power of the world. But when World War I ended, their colonial dominance declined. And the reason it declined was because, if you think about it, Europe had lost so many men during World War I that it could no longer keep its grasp on the colonies that it had before, and so those colonies gained freedom and independence, and in turn Europe lost its dominion over the world. So why did Europe's 500-year reign collapse so quickly? Well, Auguste Comte says that demographics is destiny. It's clear to see in 1914 the population is 480 million. 480. Yeah, all across Europe there's just 480 people. No, it's 480 million people. And in World War I there was 40 million casualties. So that's a lot of the men gone during the war. And more than just high casualties, World War I also reduced the birth rate. Obviously, couples were separated due to the war, so less babies were born during World War I, and this leads to demographic echoes. If you look at population charts, you can see there's a fall in the population growth in the time from the time of the the time of the First World War. A lot of births didn't happen during this time, right? So there's a decline in the population. But this leads to echoes because those children that weren't born don't have children. And it goes on, and there's these little waves in the population that we see. So yeah, not only were there a lot of casualties, there was also a lot of kids that weren't born during this time. And going back to the quote, demographics is destiny, it is clear to see that it was the destiny of Europe, um, as its population kind of declined. Um, it led to its decline, Europe's decline. And slowly, Europe's old empire and the colonial. I keep saying colonial, but what I mean to say is colonies. My bad. It's been a long day. Slowly, the colonies gain freedom and break away from Europe. So the question we have to ask is, did Europe's success lead to its self-destruction? We see in a lot of flourishing cultures the tendency to self-destruct. So the question we have to ask here is, was this inevitable for Europe? Was this essentially suicide of Europe? Was it going to happen? And to do this, we're going to look at a experiment performed by Dr. Calhoun, his mouse utopia that he created in 1972, which he called Universe 25, because this was the 25th version of this mouse utopia that he had made. And basically, Calhoun takes this 101 square inch tank, and he makes this whole elaborate housing system, and he gives endless supplies of food and water, and he also regulates temperature. So everything about this is regulated by Calhoun to make it perfect for flourishing, right? Mice don't have to worry about where they're going to sleep, where they're going to get their food. There's that safety and protection that he provides. And at first, the population of mice doubles. Mice are doing well. But the mice start to get bored, and there's a lot of senseless violence that happens. Mothers start to abandon their babies or even eat their young. Mice focus a lot more on grooming themselves and keeping up appearances because they have nothing else to do. They don't have to search for food. And there's a lot of just violence that's happening, and a lot less mating, and a lot less of just surviving. And eventually, first, right, the population rises, then it maintains the same, and eventually the whole population self-annihilates. There's no mice left at the end, which is really interesting to see. And from Calhoun's experiment, we see this interesting hypothesis that he brings up about humans in general. The hypothesis that if a culture or society is flourishing, will it lead to its own self-destruction because it has nothing else to reach for? Now, obviously, humans have their agency over their life, so we're not like mice that can, and so we're not going to self-annihilate like the mice did in Calhoun's experiment. But it is interesting to look at how flourishing societies tend to self-destruct. And so, was it inevitable for Europe? We don't know, but it's just interesting to look at that. So yeah, that's our first argument. Did the population density and affluence have a toxic effect on Europe? And I guess that's not really our first argument. Our first argument was that Europe declined in its dominance and the USA rose in its dominance. So our second argument is that World War I begins a radical period of change in technological advancement. We see this in trenches, airplanes, military hardware, blood banks, air traffic control, and plastic surgery. Military hardware. Suspenders that they had before World War I were replaced by belts, right? Wristwatches. Everyone wears today. Used to be pocket watches, but a lot of people, it's more convenient in a war to have a wristwatch than it is to pull it out of your pocket while you're trying to shoot and load your machine gun, right? So that's the military hardware. We see a lot happening in the air for the first time. Obviously, this is the first war that was fought using airplanes and drones, and so air traffic control has to be done for the first time because planes have to be regulated. Trenches are used, and trench warfare was first used in 1914 at the start of the war. Blood banks. Really interesting. Before this time, people didn't necessarily use human blood. Blood transfusions were done with like lamb blood or whatever, which obviously affects people to a certain extent, so that's kind of interesting. But U.S. Army doctor Captain Oswald Robertson made the first blood bank in 1917, and he used sodium citrate to keep the blood from I can't say this word, from like coagulating, and he kept it on ice so it could be transferred during battles and be used for the most wounded people. And before this, blood transfusions were done directly from person to person, like a car battery, which is just weird to be like, here, bro, you want my blood? Sure. And just like hook up to each other. Ooh. Anyway, yeah, that's blood banks. Plastic surgery. Kim Kardashian and all those other Hollywood celebrities with their fake lips and their fake butts have World War I to thank for that technological innovation that is plastic surgery. During World War I, there was a lot of face wounds because of shrapnel and machine guns. And so for the first time, people can pioneer techniques of plastic surgery because it's necessary and they have a lot of faces to work on. Harold Gillies was horrified by some of the facial wounds and injuries that he saw, and he pioneered some of the first techniques of plastic surgery. And it's kind of crazy that we humans are made to kind of fix ourselves back together, but sometimes you need a little help. So like if your nose was blown off, you would take a little skin from your forehead, a little cartilage that would grow back, and you'd put it on your nose and like make a new nose, which is crazy and just amazing. So yeah, that's the technological innovations. And then thirdly, World War I ended the dominance of monarchy in European politics and brought the rise of democracy with all its negative effects. So democracy rises in Europe, which in turn leads to the rise of Hitler, who was elected in a new German democratic system. And democracy was linked to totalitarianism, and it also led to the rise of propaganda as a political tool. So it wasn't necessarily a great thing, not that democracy is a bad thing at all, but in this case it kind of led to election of Adolf Hitler, kind of helped cause World War III, 2. There's not that I know of, but who knows? I'm not up to date, obviously. Anyway, I'm sorry. I have this really cool quote from Woodrow Wilson. I'm just going to read all of it because it is a really powerful quote. According to Wilson, the reason he wanted to enter the First World War was to preserve democracy and spread it across the world. And he says, "We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no domination. We shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations, for a universal dominion of right by such a concert of free peoples as shall bring peace and safety to all nations and make the world itself at last free." Wilson saw autocracy as an obstacle of spreading democracy, and he pulled a neutral America into the war and argued that America shouldn't go in selfishly, but he argued, "Let us be very clear and make to all the world what our motives and objects are." This is Wilson speaking. "To vindicate the principles of peace and justice in life of the world as against selfish and autocratic power." So yeah, that's Wilson's aims kind of for going into the war. He wanted to save the world for democracy, kind of. Who said that? I don't know. I'll have to look it up. If you know, write it in the comments below. I feel like it was Franklin Roosevelt or someone. I think it was Roosevelt. Yeah, probably. Anyway, so yeah. Power. Oh yeah, propaganda. This is fun. Power is expressed in a democratic setting via the use of propaganda. It keeps nations' morals up and gives everyone the sense that they must hate their enemy. Propaganda is used a lot in World War I. There's 3 types of propaganda. There's front propaganda for the people in the front to keep their morale up, home front propaganda, and then foreign propaganda. Germany took away the freedom of press during World War I, and this worked so well that a lot of the soldiers would read the newspapers about battles that they had fought or about their regiments, and they wouldn't see themselves in these stories. Germany sent out 7,400 press releases a day, which is crazy. And the contrast between reality and propaganda in Germany was so stark that when Germany lost the war, they felt actually betrayed. And yeah, German nationalism was shown in a lot of their propaganda. But it's just so interesting how propaganda affected the psyche of the German person. And then in Britain, we see propaganda as well in the Wellington House, which was established in 1914, and its existence was secret, and its aims was to kind of subtly affect the human psyche through kind of inception of ideas, using people and authors such as Rudyard Kipling and Arthur Doyle, and these authors wrote essays, and people read them thinking that it was the authors themselves' opinion, but no, really it was propaganda. Propaganda from Britain showed Germans as barbaric. They reported that Germans were using the human body parts in their factories and making stuff like boots and candles, and yeah, Britain spread a lot of lies about Germany, and kind of the point was to make everyone hate their common enemy, to make an enemy, right? Because fear is such a motivator for humans. So propaganda was really effective. And in America, there's the Creel Committee, which was formed by Wilson to try to influence the public opinion in favor of the war. And Wilson, in this group, not Wilson himself, but in the Creel Committee, there were these 4-minute men that would go around and make 4-minute speeches to people to convince them of why the war was such a good thing. And so, yeah, that's kind of propaganda and its use. But overall, propaganda was used in a democratic system. And we see in World War I how it transformed the world in 3 ways. Firstly, it led to the decline of Europe as the dominant power of the world and led to America's rise. Secondly, it ended the ancient traditions and brought and paved a way for new technological innovation. And then thirdly, it ended the dominance of monarchy and led to the rise of democracy in European politics. Guys, have a good week. Thank you for watching. Please don't like, please don't subscribe, please leave me alone. I will be here next week talking more about World War I, its effects, Dadaism. So stay tuned because I'm going to have fun with that one. Okay, bye.